Welcome to the first of the GCSE video lessons. Today we're going to be looking at the introduction to the Germany course, which is the first course of the four that we'll be covering. So most of what we are going through, with the exception of a bit at the end, is not ever explicitly on your exam. You will not be expected to be know all of this in testable detail. It is, however, important partly so you might want to make reference to it in an essay to show off, but also just so you can understand a little bit more about what's going on in Germany at the time. So this is more about gathering a feeling of Germany up until 1918 rather than making assiduous notes because there's very little point. So, as mentioned in the lesson, Germany was a series of unified independent states or countries. It didn't actually exist as we commonly know it until 1871. Before that, Prussia, which is the large part on the right-hand side of Germany, if you notice, actually it's a very different shape. A lot of that right-hand eastern side no longer is there as a result of the Treaty of Versailles and other treaties. But that area there, Prussia systematically conquered most of those German states through either fear, through direct warfare, or through making alliances. And bit by bit, it said unified, other people say conquested or took over the various German-speaking states in the previous, what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. The important thing about this is to realize that Germany is a made-up idea. It, in reality, was never really a thing. Arguably, in the 800s, under a chap called Charlemagne, there was vaguely a country which was vaguely around the Germans. And if you go further back, there were the Germanians who fought off the Roman Empire well in, sort of, we're talking 300-400 AD or so. But that's far, far in the past, and those people were very different to the people today. Why this is important is this means that you have lots of different regions, for example, Bavaria in the sort of lime green at the very south, which have very distinguished cultures. They are, for example, in Bavaria, it's very, very Catholic, when the rest of Germany is very Protestant. It is very conservative, traditional, and rural. If you compare that to somewhere like Berlin, which is very Protestant, very Prussian, very business orientated, very factory orientated, but also very dominated by the elites, and then compare that to a place like Hamburg, up near the neck with Denmark, which is very liberal, very progressive, very forward thinking. The Frankfurter, which was the not the sausage, but the sort of equivalent to the Guardian newspaper in Germany. It was not an accident. It was part of Frankfurt and Hamburg, the very liberal cities in the north and centre regions. And there were also areas which were owned by essentially monarchs or kings, although they were often called dukes, and the grand duchies, which didn't even have any democracy. So the problem is, how do you make these people who, until 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, feel German? And feel like they're not just being oppressed by the Prussians and taken over by the Prussians. And essentially what happens as a result of the unification is, under a chap called Bismarck, the Chancellor, the Iron Chancellor, they decide that they are going to make everyone feel German. And the way you do that is you introduce education, where you talk about history, language, and culture, and look how much similar we are, and look how much we are German. Actually, we should have been German all along, because look at our history, etc., etc. There's a lot of very made-up history as part of this, as I'm sure you can imagine. And we hate those guys over there, because it's very important. If you are going to gather a sense of nationalism, which is what we're talking about, the image of we are these people, this is what we stand for, and we should stand together and do what we're told because we are these people, you need an enemy. Now, the enemy at this period were the French and the Austrians, and to a much lesser extent, although certainly they're the Jews. Anti-Semitism is certainly an issue even in this period in Germany. Arguably, it's been an issue since the Reformation, many centuries ago. So what we have in Germany is a much higher amount of nationalism, fanatical loyalty to the country, hatred of others, and support of militarism. Obviously, most Germans were not Nazis in this period, but it's very important to realize that it's not an accident that we see nationalistic parties emerging in Germany when things get bad, because actually there's a tradition of nationalism encouraged by the government. So Germany before the war is run by the emperor, the king is, or Kaiser is his title, his reality is somewhere in between the two. He is not a very good emperor, king, Kaiser, whatever you want to do. I'll be using Kaiser for the rest of this lesson, because he is actually trying to do a very relatively delicate balancing act. Bismarck invented a system which gave the image of democracy. There was a Reichstag, which is the German for Parliament, which had political parties which were voted in by universal manhood suffrage, which even Britain at the time didn't have universal manhood suffrage. That meant that all men could vote, no matter how poor, and had even socialists in the Reichstag. However, without going into far too much detail, in reality, the system was designed to make sure all the power actually lay with the elites. The elites, by elites we mean the rich and powerful, the army officers, the landowners, the industrialists, the senior judges, and the senior civil servants. Civil servants are people who run parts of the government when the politicians are away, or basically do the day-to-day stuff. Politicians make the decisions, the civil servants get stuff done. In order to keep the middle classes happy, though, and distracted from the fact they don't have democracy, what happens is the Kaiser Wilhelm and the elites make the Germans more and more nationalists. If you are focusing on invading other people, starting an empire and hating the French, you might not focus so much on the fact there is not a democracy. And so what we see is a slide into war and the emergence of World War I. The important thing to realize at this point is that Germany sees themselves as the defenders. They saw themselves brought into the war because they were allied. They were allied with Austria, and Austria were provoked by the Serbians. And then they were attacked by the Russians, and because the Russians allied the French, and because technically it's actually because of the invasion of Belgium, but as they saw it, because the British were allied with the French, although they weren't in any meaningful way, the British attacked them as well. So from what they saw is, we are being attacked. And in reality, most Germans supported the war at this point, mainly because they thought it would be quick. The German army was very good, it was very well led, and probably better equipped and trained, because the Germans had always focused a lot more military than any other country. This will not be the case as time goes on, but at this point, in the early stages, they have a better army. So its plan was the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan is a realization that when fighting both Russia and France, Germany cannot hope to win. It cannot fight in the east and the west with enough men. The manpower of Russia and the relative military skill of France means that it will be an impossible task. So what it requires is a quick move. Now they assume that the Russians would take, being very disorganized and huge, would take at least a month to mobilize. That means get your soldiers out, get them to the right place, give them their weapons, have a plan, etc. And in that time, their plan was to, as you can see on the map, sweep through Belgium rather than the border with France, where the French might be expecting an attack, sweep through, attack Paris, and take over in a matter of weeks. Now this plan fails. Not because it's a bad plan, it's an optimistic plan, not necessarily a bad one, but the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, fight the Germans in many key battles, along with the French, obviously, along the border with Belgium, and slow down the Germans. And so the Germans are forced to do something they really didn't want to do, which was a war of attrition. A war of attrition is basically a war where you just try and kill as many men as possible and to make them surrender, because people at home are sick of their husbands, their sons, etc. dying. So this is trench warfare. You will have certainly covered that to some extent in lower school, lower down the years, so we won't go into too much detail. It doesn't really matter. But what it means is Germany is holding the line. It's in other people's land, which is very important, which we shall discuss in a second. But it can't push out. It hasn't got the men. It's splitting up its soldiers between eastern and western fronts, Russians and French, which means that, unfortunately for them, they cannot have enough men to attack either way. The British and French keep attacking them, and obviously if you are defending a trench, that means you're inside the trench, as you can see in the picture, with machine guns and rifles, you're obviously going to kill more French and Englishmen than are going to kill you. But despite that, they aren't actually getting any closer to winning. They decide at Verdun, which is on the bottom map, to bleed France white. What that means is there's no point taking land. Land doesn't matter in this war. They want to make the French surrender. And the way they're going to do that is not by taking the whole of France, because that would take years. Is they're going to kill so many Frenchmen that the French people want peace. So they decide to have a battle at Verdun, which for various reasons is a good space to attack the French, because they're in range of lots of artillery and they're not very well defended. And they start to have a war there. And they have a massive battle at the Battle of Verdun, and all it does is there's about 1 million casualties on both sides combined. More Frenchmen than Germans were killed, but not massively more. And in reality, all it means is it doesn't help the war, doesn't make France surrender anymore, and kills lots of Germans. And what we start to see after the Verdun is two things. People start to think maybe the war should be made a peace. Maybe we should go to peace. Not surrender. No one in Germany wants to be seen as a coward. So no one says surrender. But they say, well, we are fighting a defensive war. We are defending ourselves. So why don't we make a peace, which means that they won't invade us? And therefore, that's all we're fighting for, right? Now, obviously, you can't do this because that wasn't the reason they went to war. And that was a convenient lie for the government. But still, instead, they decided a policy of total war. Total war means you put every military, economic, and individual resource to fighting the war. Every person is helping the war effort. Every piece of food is helping the war effort. Every factory is only producing stuff to help the war effort. Okay, this is great on paper and it does help them make more weapons, etc. But obviously it upsets people. People are being forced to work. Okay, you can't work as a lawyer because that's not useful for the war effort. You need to work in this factory at much lower rates. Obviously, if all the food's being saved for the army, that means there's less rations, less food for people at home who start to starve. Protesters who go against it are shot in the street, and there's increased censorship. Censorship is where you ban people from writing bad things about the government. Okay, at the same time, the British blockade the German forces by using the North Sea and the Channel. Now, the British have a massive navy, not necessarily the best navy, but a huge navy, far bigger than the Germans, and therefore the Germans can't really attack it, and therefore the British can stop any food getting to Germany. If you think about the map, the east is Russia, so you can't get food through there. The sea is obviously the British. France is to the west. To the south is the Italians, who are also at war with the Germans. So the only place you can get food is through a very long route going through Austria, going through the Balkans, that's modern day Eastern Europe, the southern bit of Eastern Europe, through the Ottoman Empire, through the Mediterranean, which is also controlled by the British, and then through there. So actually, obviously it's not going to happen. What this causes, therefore, is a massive food shortages, massive suffering. About 500,000 people, civilians died. It's really controversial how many died. 460, 470 is about the number that most historians are agreeing on, but it changes every couple of years. 460, 470,000 people die of starvation, malnutrition, or disease. Because when you lack food, your immune system, your ability to fight things off, is compromised. So, come in 1917, the Germans think they need to force Britain to leave the war before they're starved out. Now, what they decide to do is they are going to destroy all the food supplies coming to Britain. Now, they can't use their ships which are on the surface because the British Royal Navy ships will see those ships and sink them. But if they use submarines of ships which go under the water, and go underneath the British ships won't notice them. And then in the Atlantic Ocean, the submarines can sink the British ships, causing the British to run out of food and then starve and therefore surrender. However, this was very unpopular amongst Germans. The reason it was unpopular is because the USA had said in 1915 that if you keep doing this, when they were doing the same thing in 1915, we will go to war. And the Germans in 1915 said, fine, we won't do it anymore. But 1917, they're desperate, so they do it. And obviously, what it causes is USA to come into the war in April 1917. Now, you cannot win a war against America. A little bit later on, but this is basically the same true. If you look at the amount of factory capacity, not actual factories actually making weapons, but in theory the number of factories who could make weapons. In 1937, the Americans had 42% of the entire world's factory capacity to make weapons, if they so chose. That's more than Britain, Japan, Germany and France put together. Okay, they are huge. They have factories, they have men, they have money, they have technology. They will win. Now, The USA, for reasons we don't really care about, has always had a small standing army, very small army. Nowadays it has a huge one, but that's only as a result of the Cold War and World War II. They had a very small army, not very well trained, not very well equipped. So it's going to take them a year to get all the equipment, get all the weapons, bring it over to France, get them ready, etc., etc. So the Germans have a time limit. They are also quite lucky that in October 1917, the Russian Revolution, the rise of the communists, who we'll be talking about in the Cold War particularly, mean that Russia leaves the war. That means all those troops on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians can now go over in the Western Front. So the war is at a period of crisis. There's still a chance to win, but it's a smaller and smaller chance as time goes on. At home, without going into too much detail why, the people are starting to question the government. The total war is upsetting them. The starvation is upsetting them. The amount of Germans dying is upsetting them. And the fact that they still think that they can just make peace and say, let's just call it a draw, and that the Allies will agree, and that all they see is that their government, the German government, the Kaiser, is saying, no, we're not going to do that. So they start getting angry. On one side is the SPD, the Socialist Democratic Party, and the Catholic Centre Party, although the Centre Party will become Protestant as well. Both parties are very popular. Obviously, the SPD, being socialist, is popular amongst the workers. The Catholics are popular amongst the Catholics and the middle classes. So this is the big chunk of German opinion against the war. And they don't say surrender, but they say, let's call it a draw. The Allies have suffered enough. We're not cowards. We just want to say, you know what, we're defending ourselves. We've defended ourselves. It's fine. Let's call it off. Come 1918, the last sort of dash offensive, the last chance to try and get rid of the Allies, destroy the French, destroy the British before the Americans arrive, is the spring offensive. This actually works quite well. They push quite a far back. They actually get relatively close to Paris, but eventually they are stopped. Basically, you can't go too fast in war because your supplies, your weapons, your food, your ammunition don't catch up, because you need lorries to keep moving back and forwards. Except for in this time, you don't have lorries, you have horses and carts for the most part. So the war, after the spring offensive fails, it's quite clear the war will eventually be lost. To avoid taking the blame for losing the war, therefore, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, these two guys will be, as I mentioned in the lesson, will be very important in the future. So it's well worth bearing this in mind. And they resign. They also tell the Kaiser that they will not defend him. Basically, they say to him, you need to leave the throne. That's a very subtle hint of their saying, if we don't defend you, you're going to die, so you better leave. The reason they're doing this is not because they hate the Kaiser. It's because they care about themselves more. Germany at the time is full of riots, socialist uprising, and mutinies. Mutiny is when soldiers refuse to follow orders. So there's a big one in the Navy. The sailors of the fleet refuse to sail out of the sort of Kiel, which is a big sort of naval base near Denmark. And they think, if the Kaiser goes, people will think, you know what, it's changed enough, we'll just have a democracy and we'll leave it at that. That means the rich people, the elites like Hindenburg and Ludendorff, will keep their position, keep their money, keep their power. If, however, the Kaiser stays, then what will happen is socialist revolution, and with socialist revolution, as what happened in the Russian Revolution, the rich will be put up against the wall and shot, much like the Kaiser. They do not want that. So we have this crisis. Because they want the Kaiser to abdicate, the Kaiser refuses to abdicate. In reality, what Ebert does is something quite smug and quite clever. He announces that the Kaiser has abdicated. Now, the Kaiser hasn't abdicated, but once you announce it publicly that he has, the Kaiser, when he comes out and says, no, I haven't abdicated, he looks ridiculous and people don't believe him. Well, I've read here that you've abdicated, you've left the throne, and so you clearly have. And eventually he insists quite a lot that he hasn't abdicated, and then eventually gives up and flees to Holland. And that's the last we'll see of him on this course. It doesn't really matter. He does write a few letters to Hitler when Hitler comes to power saying, well, it's time for me to come back. Hitler ignores the letters, obviously. But once you get rid of a king, it's not actually clear what you have in its place. You might say, well, let's have a democracy. But every democracy in Europe, and actually there's not that many at this time, have a different way of doing things. You've got this sort of more proportional representation, equal, more democratic, but chaotic system of France. You've got a much more traditional power, where the rich have power, parliament in Britain. So they don't know what to do. So what the Ebert, who is the leader of the SPD, decides to do is he says we're going to have a vote. We're going to write a constitution. A constitution, as we'll look at next lesson, is the list of rules and powers that the people have to, the government has to follow, and what it can and what it cannot do. In reality, of this vote, the SPD and the Z are the Catholics, the Zentrum, the Centre Party. They basically dominate the vote. They get about 78%. Off the top of my head, 78% of the vote with the DDP. But don't worry about them. There's another party. We'll talk about those in due course. And they basically write the Constitution. And that's the Constitution that we will be studying. So that's what you should remember when we study the Constitution, that it's written by the SPD and the Catholics who don't really know what they're doing. So all of that is background. To finish up, I'm going to talk a little bit about the stab in the back myth. This is something, depending on the lesson, how much we do, we don't have time to cover, or we sometimes do have time to cover in class. So particularly if we didn't cover this in lesson, because all the sticking in sheets that we do in the first lesson becomes problematic, then of course you need to make notes of this. So Germany had been defeated. Germany had been absolutely destroyed. The soldiers were on the run, the people were starving, the Americans were coming. However, many Germans actually thought they hadn't lost. They weren't winning, but they hadn't lost. And there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, if you look at the front line, apart from a very small part in the south, most of the war and most of the front line is still in France and Belgium. They haven't actually got into Germany. So actually, as they can see it, they can say it was quite clearly a draw. We stopped pushing forwards, but you haven't pushed us back. As well as this, the Germans constantly always killed more people than they died themselves, because they were usually defending, but also they had a slightly better trained army. As well as that, they had just had a couple of million troops, well, not a couple of million, 1.5 million troops coming over from the Eastern Front to back up. And they said, well, we had all these troops, we could have carried on attacking. Now that's not the case, and that's not true, but that's what they believe. As well as that, there's emotional factors. If you've lost your son, you've lost your husband, etc., in a war, you don't want to make it feel like it was entirely for nothing. You don't want to make it feel like, despite him dying, Germany still lost. So many people would prefer to believe the idea that actually we were doing all right. So what happens is the idea of the stab in the back myth is created in the media almost straight after the war. The people who push it are the people who control the media. These are the people who are very right-wing, very conservative, usually very rich, and very anti-democratic. They do not like the new system. They like the old system. They had the power in the Kaiser system. They're worried about democracy, what's going to happen. So they create this myth, and as you can see on the pictures, it's a good summary. What this is the idea that the German army and the everyday German soldier, like your son who was killed, like you were when you fought in the army, could have won the war because you guys are amazing. If it was not for traitors at home because of their own greed or cowardice who ended the war early or made it so that you couldn't possibly win. The myth completely differs depending on who you're talking about. So when they're talking about communists, they say, had the communists not been rebelling and doing all these revolutions, we would have had all the weapons we needed to win the war. Whereas when they're talking about the SPD and the Jews, they tend to say a little bit more. These people were cowards and they made peace too early. Anyway, this does not really grab people's attention straight away. Partly because it's quite clear when people are living that world that most of this isn't true. But as time goes on and people forget parts, you'll be surprised how quickly people's memory, particularly when the media is constantly telling you, oh, no, it was this. Oh, no, it was this. It's actually fine, it was this. You might not have seen it, but you can't be expected to see the entire world. Can't be expected to see the entire what's going on. So maybe it's true. Also, what makes it particularly popular is the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, which we'll talk about in future, although she knew a little bit about, as we will discuss, in Germans' imagination, they had not lost the war, it was a draw, and then they had a peace which is brutal. And for them, they don't understand the difference. The only explanation is the government has made a mistake. It's the government's fault. And therefore, the government is bad. And then people start believing, well, actually, if they're bad, they must have stabbed us in the back. Now, obviously, not everyone believes in stab in the back myth, and if you're right wing, you're more likely to believe it than if you're left wing. But the important thing about stab in the back is it becomes the catch all. What that means is it applies to everything. Problem, which caused all of Germany's problems amongst people on the right. Many people, including Hitler, argued that the cause of all of Germany's economic problems, the fact that it's broke, the fact that it's chaotic, the political problems, the fact that the government's very weak, the fact there's nothing really happening, social problems, the fact there's massive poverty and there's all sorts of problems going on there. We'll talk about all these problems in due course. They're not complex things as caused by very complex issues which everyone is facing. No, they're caused by this one simple issue: stab in the back. This means that people will support people like Hitler, who says, well, what we'll do is we'll go back on the Treaty of Versailles and we'll attack those people who stabbed us in the back, and we'll go back to war if needs be, and we will therefore undo all the damage. And once we undo the damage, we will undo the problems. We will undo all the issues, because if stab in the back and Treaty of Versailles caused it, if we undo it, that will undo all the problems. At the same time, just as importantly, the stab in the back myth also means that people increasingly stop supporting the countries and the parties who had signed the peace, the SPD, and to a much lesser extent the Catholics. When Hitler is trying to get the Centre Party on side, he gets rid of all that blaming the Catholics and the Centre Party. He intends to focus on the SPD, the Communists, and the Jews, because they're a lot more unpopular amongst more people. So what it does is it really gets rid of support for these people. Now, the stab in the back myth I will mention in due course, and it's an important idea. So you don't need to worry too much, but it's very important that you have an idea of why this is important. The real key idea here is it's not true, but it doesn't matter if it's not true. Life is not about what's true and what's not true. It's what people believe to be true. And they believed it would be true, particularly after the Treaty of Versailles. And what this does is it gives some a political party, if you think similar to, I don't know, a political party in modern day who might blame all the problems on one particular issue of some description, then similar, and it becomes popular because of that. Similar thing. Okay, people like simple solutions. People like simple problems. All my problems are this one thing. People buy into that. People support you. And also, it means that people increasingly distrust the SPD and fear the role of Jews and underhanded, dark, conspiratorial forces harming them from behind and destroying the war and therefore causing all the problems. You'll notice one last thing. The evolution, the change on who is to be blamed is clear. The top one is a very early 1919 picture. The bottom one is a Nazi-inspired, not quite Nazi, it comes from a place called Simplicitus, which is a Nazi-inspired magazine, but later image. And you see the movement has gone from politicians and bankers, which as time goes on, Hitler increasingly made friends with because they paid for his party, moved over to Jews. And as we discuss later, in this period, to many Germans, Jew meant communist, and we'll explain why in future lessons. I hope that's very helpful. We will next session be looking at the Constitution. That's a much quicker one because that's quite small, but for now I will see you in the future.